Hi, welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I am Liz Cavell, an attorney here at FFRF, and joining me today are fellow attorneys Patrick Elliott and Chris Line. And today we are talking about prayer at city council meetings, prayer at government meetings. We are going to talk about FFRF's latest lawsuit that we filed in federal court against Parkersburg, West Virginia. But first, we want to talk a little bit about a victory we just had in federal court at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in California. And that was a lawsuit that we filed against a school board for similarly praying at school board meetings. That was the Chino Valley Unified School District. They opened all school board meetings with prayer led by local clergy members, and school board members routinely proselytized and read from the Bible throughout different times of the meeting, including during the public comment periods and during and after the opening ceremonies. And so we challenged that in federal district court. We won, and the school board appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, where we finally got a unanimous decision holding that their practice of prayer before their school board meetings violates the Establishment Clause. And so we're really thrilled about that. And the school board meetings is sort of a subcontext of prayer at government events, and it's a little bit different than prayer at city council meetings and other legislative meetings, and we can kind of talk about the differences later. But I want to get us back to the lawsuit that we just filed yesterday against the Parkersburg City Council in West Virginia. And Patrick and Chris worked on this lawsuit, so Patrick, just tell us what's going on in Parkersburg. Why did we sue the city council?
Well, this goes back several years. We actually sent a letter to the city council in 2015, informing the city council that their prayers were unconstitutional. So what the city council does at every meeting is they all collectively stand, get the members, the audience members who are attending to stand, and collectively in unison recite the Lord's Prayer. We received a complaint about that several years ago, as I said, in 2015. We wrote to the city council asking them to stop, to come into compliance with the law. They had refused, and so since that time, they've been liable potentially to be sued. And so yesterday we did file suit. I think we have a local West Virginia news clip that we could show, kind of talking about the lawsuit that was filed yesterday.
I stand up and lead the Lord's Prayer prior to the council meeting. We start about 7:29. It's totally voluntary. If people want to participate, they can. And as council president, my feeling is that I'll continue to allow that voluntary prayer session unless the court orders otherwise.
We believe in religious freedom and people's rights to express their religious beliefs, but we do not agree with the city of Parkersburg sanctioning one religion in violation of our Establishment Clause by leading this prayer when and how they do.
So that was Eric Engel, one of our plaintiffs in the lawsuit. And then, of course, you saw, I think, the council president saying, yes, I do indeed lead the Lord's Prayer at meetings, and I'll continue to do that until I get a court order. He mentioned that the prayer is voluntary. How exactly, break it down a little more, like what goes down at these meetings, and why is he wrong?
Right. Well, I would say this in every case that's ever been brought that we've seen in the public schools or challenges where prayer's been ruled unconstitutional, it's always been voluntary. Nobody is actually forcing via somebody to put their hands together and pray. What is going on is coercive, a group mentality where everybody stands and recites the same prayer at every single meeting is a problem. And so when they do the prayer, they start out the meeting this way. They then go into the Pledge of Allegiance, which is something that many members of the audience stand and participate for. And then they go into public business, which our plaintiffs and many other people in the city have keen interest in, making sure that their cities run a way that their voice is heard. So I think there's the aspect to it that everybody participating is a problem. What's unique also about Parkersburg is people do feel pressured. For instance, one of the city council members in the past has glared at people sitting in the front row who were sitting during the prayer. And I think we have a video clip of that as well, of kind of give you an idea of the atmosphere of what these prayers are like.
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Wow, so that was the Parkersburg City Council giving me flashbacks to my Catholic school days. Yeah. So we saw that council member, second from the left there, or our left.
Eric Barber is the council member's
right.
name.
And he sort of looked up during the prayer, and you're saying glaring, surveying the audience, like taking note of who's sitting, who's standing. And then what was going on there at the end, Chris? It looks kind of like he's miking up.
Right, he straightens his microphone out before he's even done with the prayer, and then leans in, pushes his button so that the mic's active, and says "Amen" as loud as he can, as if he's taunting someone with the Amen. The people, presumably the people not standing or participating in this prayer.
Right. So a lot of our viewers probably know or are aware that the U.S. Supreme Court has obviously ruled on this before, or ruled on prayer at city council meetings. Back in the 80s, and then most recently in 2014 in the Town of Greece versus Galloway case, where Greece, New York, the town council prayed before their city council meetings. And we know that generally the U.S. Supreme Court said that in itself does not violate the Establishment Clause, because it was sort of historically tolerated during the time of the framers, therefore it doesn't implicate the Establishment Clause. So why is what Parkersburg is doing different? Why are we still suing Parkersburg despite the fact that the Supreme Court seems to have said prayer at city council meetings is okay? Chris?
Yeah, well, the reason is that you correctly stated that Greece, Town of Greece v. Galloway, said there's no constitutional bar on sectarian prayers, like always, like that there are circumstances where you can have sectarian prayers at these meetings. They don't have to be non-sectarian, as in non-denominational for everyone. That's what they said. But they did still, in Town of Greece, affirm that there is still Establishment Clause issues in this area, that the Establishment Clause still does apply to legislative prayer, just that it's going to be a little different standard than in some other areas. In particular, they kind of focused on 4 issues. Who's giving the prayer? In both Marsh and Greece, chaplains were giving the prayer. In Marsh, they were paying chaplains to come in and give the prayer, and in Greece, they were just inviting chaplains to give the prayer. Here, as in a recent case that came out of the Fourth Circuit, Lund v. Rowan County, it's the legislators themselves giving the prayer. And that is a pretty big distinction between those 2 cases. I think they summed it up pretty well in London, saying that in Marsh, they paid someone to give the prayer. In Town of Greece, they invited someone to give the prayer. But in Rowan County, the legislators themselves, the state itself, was giving the prayer. The same situation we have here. These city council members lead this prayer. They give this prayer. It is a state, giving the prayer. The other circumstances that they kind of looked at were participation, whether they were asking for participation from the crowd. That wasn't happening so much in Town of Greece or in Marsh. Here, you can see from various video clips that we have of city council meetings, they'll either the president will use his hands to signal for everyone to stand, or the entire city council will stand, and that's a signal to everyone else to stand that it's time for the prayer. Another big factor is that they handle city business at these meetings. That was something in Marsh and Town of Greece that was distinguished, that it wasn't mixing religion in with the city business. And then another factor is the composition of the prayers, whether they're all Christian or whether there's an opportunity for other groups or other religions, other types of prayer to occur. Now, the court didn't say that, you know, there was some mandate that like they can't be mostly Christian. They didn't put a quota or a system on it. But in town of Greece, one of the main factors that allowed them to find that constitutional was that theoretically anybody could give a prayer. Atheists, other minority religions, everybody could have a say. There was no bar on that. Here, as in the Rowan County case that recently came out of the Fourth Circuit, the legislators are leading the prayer. In this case, it's only the Lord's Prayer that they say each time. There's no opportunity for you know, other participation from other prayers. There's no opportunity for other messages. It's just this very Christian prayer straight out of the Bible every single meeting.
Right. So every single meeting, Parkersburg City Council says the Lord's Prayer. So this is, the Lord's Prayer is just kind of a statement of creed, right? Right out of the Bible. So, oh, what do we have here? Oh.
So this is the Lord's Prayer out of the Bible.
Yeah, I don't read my Bible very often.
The Lord's Prayer, I mean, this is the thing that we point out in the lawsuit, but you know, you could read the Lord's Prayer, you know, in the Gospel of Matthew, but people have added, you know, what they call a concluding, like doxology. So, you know, that's the, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. That's the part that's not biblical, that's added. What's interesting about, you know, the Lord's Prayer is just before the Lord's Prayer in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus apparently is teaching, you know, his disciples how to pray. And, you know, and what's in that is basically saying, you know, go into your private room and pray. Don't pray like the hypocrites do, to pray before other people to be seen, which is exactly what city council members are doing when they're praying the Lord's Prayer to be seen by everybody. Of course, they could pray this prayer on their own time or in their own way, but they intend to be seen by other people, which is actually unbiblical if you're reading just before where the Lord's Prayer is in the Bible.
Right, yeah.
I mean,
guess
yeah,
they
like,
skipped that part.
as you put it, like, it's literally 4 verses before. The Lord's Prayer starts at Matthew 6:9. I think Matthew 6:5 is, you know, don't be like the hypocrites who pray publicly, you know, go into your closet and pray. And here's an example of a prayer you can do, and that's where the Lord's Prayer is. And so they've taken that example of this private prayer, how to pray, and they're like, let's do it before the meeting for everyone. You know,
So
you alluded
close.
that it, you know, reminds you of, you know, Catholic school.
Right.
It reminds me of when I go to like a friend's house who's religious, and before we eat, they'll do, you know, they'll say grace or something before we eat, and I kind of go, oh, this kind of is awkward, but, you know, you do it because it's a private, it's their home, like, whatever, but this is a public city council meeting. So you go to your city council meeting, suddenly everybody stands up around you and starts saying this prayer in unison, and you're like, I'm sorry, what? Like, especially if you're not familiar with it, you're just, what is everyone saying? Why is this? Just a church. I mean, a church environment is really what it ends up being at all of these meetings. Just this.
I mean, and one of the things that we've pointed out in filing with the case is we're also seeking not just the complaint, but seeking a preliminary injunction. So basically, putting before the court in order that they would be prohibited from this practice. And within that motion, which Chris you know, wrote most of that motion, it points out that the courts have always been suspect of official government prayers. So even if you're religious, I think everybody should be on board with, we don't want the government establishing official prayers or composing official prayers, regardless of the content of those. And so that's something that actually traditionally Justice Kennedy, who's recently retired, has said in a number of cases, including in Greece, saying that he doesn't think the government should be composing official prayers, which is really what the city council is here doing, which, as far as we know, this is a practice that goes back decades, that they've continually inculcated twice per month at all of their regular meetings, the same exact prayer. Everybody in the room knows what's coming, and they all collectively participate.
Yeah, it does have that, you know, Catholic Mass vibe. Everybody's standing and reciting, really reciting this really sort of orthodox kind of creed-like prayer. And so I want to just kind of Chris touched on this a little, but playing a little devil's advocate, because, you know, I've been reading the comments of news articles here and reading the news coverage of this that we filed yesterday. So, of course, the layperson who's not inclined to agree with us wants to know, like Chris kind of said, like, you're at someone's kitchen table and they want to pray, like, you should just be respectful and quiet and just not participate. Why can't our plaintiffs and the few people who object to this practice just quietly tolerate it, or just come to the meeting a few minutes late or leave the room during the prayer? I mean, what is our response to that argument?
Right. I mean, this is a common refrain that we see in our cases, and I think no matter what the violation is, we get the same. You get the same type of response that people saying, "Well, why can't you just allow me to violate the Constitution?" That's basically what they're saying. Well, we have some, some people smarter than us, the justices of the Supreme Court, saying you shouldn't have to forfeit your rights, your constitutional rights, to participate in a government activity. And so that goes to the school prayer cases of you shouldn't have to forego your graduation because they're going to do a prayer at it. Same here. You shouldn't have to forego participating in city council meetings, which one of our plaintiffs is doing because he's basically been marginalized as a citizen there in order to participate. So I think really the idea that you should just tolerate it. I think we would all agree in a number of other constitutional rights that we shouldn't just like, well, why don't you just allow the government to search and seize your property or whatever. When we talk about the Bill of Rights, it's not a matter of,
right,
well, couldn't you just allow the government to do this action? And certainly some people may not object, but people who are non-religious or non-Christian in this community have a right to participate in their city council meetings without being told to engage in a particular religious practice. So I do think it's really important, and I don't think, again, the common refrain that we're also used to is, well, shouldn't you just be allowed to do this? I think when you get underneath that kind of surface review, I think you understand that, yeah, the city council, why can't the city council not do this? I mean, that's the response I'd say.
Right.
It's the city council meeting could go as planned without having this Lord's Prayer at every meeting would be the response, I guess you could say.
Right, that was a great analysis to answer the question. Even from a practical standpoint, though, you can just reverse that question on its head. Oh, why don't they tolerate this? Why don't they just deal with it? Well, same thing could be said. Why can't the counselors pray to themselves as their Bible dictates they should? Why don't they? What if before they got to the meeting they said their prayer to themselves?
Right.
Then because they want to do this publicly for the meeting. They want it to be a part. As the president had said, it's part of the meeting. It takes place. They make an argument that it takes place before the official start, before the gavel, but they know that they're doing it for the meeting, that it's part of the meeting, and they want it to be.
Right.
They could easily, and this would be constitutionally permissible for them to pray themselves. They have
silently,
the right as
perhaps.
Right. They have religious freedom. They can pray to themselves. It's just, but they don't want to pray. Their concern isn't praying. Their concern is praying in their position as government officials. And that's why they're doing it this way.
Yeah. So I was going to touch on, is it significant? Of course, it's sort of being remarked on in the news coverage that they pray before the start of the meeting. They pray before the gavel. So obviously, you kind of just pointed out why that's not legally significant.
And we touch on it in our brief for a preliminary injunction that we cite some cases out of the Fourth Circuit, which is where this is taking place, that have said prayer before the start of meetings is part of the meeting. I don't remember where it came from, but there was a judge at one point who made a good point that if this prayer was truly not part of the meeting, then there would be situations where they would just come in and pray. If the meeting's canceled, the prayer doesn't happen.
Right.
It's inextricably linked. There's no
right.
separating the two. The only reason that they're there praying is because this public meeting is taking place. There's no way to disconnect the two.
Right. So let me think. Oh, question I wanted to ask. We led off with the Chino Valley School District case, and I wanted to kind of go back to that because I think it's really interesting. So post-Greece, we're talking about in Parkersburg, what are the limits of the town of Greece case? Like, when is it still unconstitutional for city councils to pray at their meetings, or how, when and how is it still creating constitutional problems? So obviously we took a lawsuit in California suing a school district that prays at their meetings. Do you want to talk a little bit about why that situation is different from Greece? Why are we still suing on that issue?
Right. I think generally, this is helpful for the public to get an understanding, and I think judges and lawyers have this understanding already. But the school environment is particularly an area where there's coercion. Minor children are much more susceptible to pressure to engage in some type of religious practices. So for that reason, we have decades of cases going back to 1948, ruling that the separation of state and church is a real thing, particularly in our public schools. Public school board meetings, for that reason, as the Ninth Circuit ruled in our case, had to look at, well, what are these meetings like? And really they are central to public education in a given community. Students participate, students give presentations, there's a student member of the board, and all of the subject matters of the things being discussed relate to operating public schools. And so it's not just in our case that was recently decided last week, but in prior cases relating to prayers at school board meetings, the courts have always, or basically have always said, yes, this environment is more like a school setting rather than a state legislature, you know, like in the Nebraska legislature case from the 1980s. So I think courts and everyone kind of has that understanding already. So that does make these two very different things. You know, the Parkersburg situation is a problem because they're adopting an official prayer and really pushing it on people. But even a generic prayer, doesn't suffice in the school setting. So it is a good distinction for people to have an understanding.
Right. Yeah. Public schools, you know, it's not a accepted legal proposition that public school boards, school board meetings are like legislative sessions. It's been the opinion of most courts who have ever kind of examined the question that, yes, public school board meetings are more part and parcel to the day-to-day operations of public schools and the service of students. And, you know, that's a different setting than a legislative meeting. And so, yes, we are still pursuing school districts who continue, school boards who continue to pray at their meetings. So the California victory was a good one. I'm going to start looking down to see if we're getting some questions because I see some popping up from Facebook. And if you have any questions on this topic, the Parkersburg lawsuit, or just prayer at legislative meetings or city town council meetings in general, just send us your questions. You know, you can comment right now in the comment section and we'll try to get to your questions or your comments. So we got a comment from somebody, Jared in Parkersburg, saying, as a person who works in Parkersburg and pays taxes and fees to the city, thank you, which is nice, but not a question.
Well, I mean,
surprisingly,
I think people have certain stereotypes you think about West Virginia, and surprisingly, we've heard from a lot of people who don't want prayer at the city council meetings in Parkersburg. So I think people need to understand this isn't the whole community against just a few individuals. We have two individual plaintiffs in this case, but there are a number of people who just want the prayers to stop and want the city to get down to business. And so it's not one of, it's just a little surprising. I'm happy that somebody from Parkersburg is chiming in.
Yeah, and yes, it's a small-ish. I was asking Patrick, how small is this town? And he's actually like, not that small. It's a small-ish town, but what did you say?
I think they have about 31,000 residents, which, as far as West Virginia goes, that might make it the third or fourth largest city in the state.
So not a terribly small town, but a small enough town where we are hearing a lot of people who are not pleased with, you know, an official orthodoxy being invoked at every single one of their city council's government meetings. And so we appreciate hearing from you. So we've got a question here from a William Hahn, and this could go on all day, so just try to focus in. Is this type of complaint harder to fight in the era of Trump? So I think we all agree that we're kind of facing a difficult time, especially as with the Trump administration, I think, comes the changing of the federal judiciary and the makeup of the courts, not just the U.S. Supreme Court. But what do you think about that? Are we, is it getting harder to take on these types of complaints? Are you feeling any optimism at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of different ways to approach that question. You know, first, just a matter of the judiciary. Trump is appointing lifetime appointments. His appointments are getting approved. So the judiciary is changing. There are judges who would be more receptive to allowing this type of action.
Yep.
Thankfully, in the federal courts that we're in here, last year in 2017, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, as Chris mentioned, the whole panel of judges ruled that this type of practice is unconstitutional.
Right.
So the judiciary has already decided this issue in that circuit. Other places maybe haven't come to decisions on it. But the second part of this, I think, relates to, you know, what are people's attitudes? You know, how do people treat other people? I think good citizens in a community may say, oh, I understand that you don't like the prayer. I think it's okay. Maybe we should just get rid of it. Why do we have it? I think in the Trump era, there's less of that. I think there is much more take no prisoners, I'm right. And,
if you don't like it, get out.
Yeah. So I think there's both aspects kind of playing into the issues that we deal with, because the courts are changing. They haven't really changed as to this issue in this circuit, but the attitudes certainly have changed. Yeah,
that's a good point. That's a really good point. Okay, so we have a question here that I think is a good prompt for a conversation about access in this situation. And okay, we have the S word here. What if a Satanist, what if they call in a Satanist to give a prayer? Will they, city councils in this situation, suddenly want a wall of separation between state and church? So this kind of touches on an obvious strategy, although it's not probably available in the Parkersburg situation. Talk about that.
Well, there are some, it really depends on how the city council's procedures operate. So there are places like Greece, New York, that went to the Supreme Court, actually has allowed, at least an atheist, one of our members was able to deliver an invocation, and I believe they've also had a Satanist. But I think in certain places, yeah, they really can't bar somebody because they disagree with the religion if they have opened up that type of opportunity. We think the solution is just don't have a prayer at all. Why don't we just get to business and not have people be upset about the prayer or not? It does highlight the idea that some people may strongly disagree with whatever is being invoked at the city council meeting. We know of examples where people have delivered Satanist prayers, and I'm sure some of the city council members there didn't appreciate it, but they've kind of set themselves up for that scenario by including so many other Christian prayers. Again, I don't think this is necessarily applicable to this situation, but in other places, they may have to allow a Satanist prayer if they're really opening up the opportunity to the Catholic priest can come in. Well, why couldn't a local Satanist come in? I think that is actually a problem for a city that would bar that.
Yeah, as I said earlier, Town of Greece didn't say, you have to have equal representation. It wasn't like, well, if Christians do these many prayers, then you got to look and get a Satanist, and you got to allow a Jewish prayer, you have to allow an atheist prayer, anything like that. But a large part of the analysis was the idea that that would be a possibility. Like that maybe 99% of the prayers would be Christian, but there's nothing barring someone else. So under that sort of thought, a city council that did bar certain groups and said, oh, we're going to let all of these religions, but not this one speak, in my opinion, and FFRF's opinion, would be violating that, and that would not be a permissible practice. As we said, that's not really the problem here in Parkersburg, and in the Lund v. Rowan County case in the Fourth Circuit, this was a big part of their analysis, was that it is a closed universe of prayer givers. Only the legislators can give prayers, and thus there's no possibility that there will ever be a different type of prayer, and that's one of the main reasons why they found that it was unconstitutional. So opening it up to everyone seems to be, the way things are moving, and is, the best way to do it. But like we said, our push would be just don't have prayer at all. But if you do, you should have to include everybody. It just seems
So distinguishing like the factual scenario in the Town of Greece case, which is the big Supreme Court case where their policy and practice was to have a rotating list of guest clergy that could come and deliver a prayer, versus Parkersburg, as you said, which is they just lead the same exact prayer, the Lord's Prayer, every time by standing up and just starting to lead everyone in that exact prayer. Obviously, those are very distinguishable, but that the sort of the crux of like what you're saying, Chris, and how the Supreme Court framed it is the prayer policy can't be used by the city to show discrimination against any faith or minority faith. So when you have, a rotating list of clergy who's invited to give the invocation and the criteria are XYZ, a Satanist, whatever that means to people, or an atheist coming along saying, hey, I'd like to do it. If they're discriminated against, if they're treated in a discriminatory way, that makes the prayer policy and practice vulnerable. Obviously, it can't be used by the city to show that they are discriminating against certain faiths. And of course, the the whole point of using that strategy is to show people who are in the majority religion how uncomfortable it feels to sit at the seat of government and listen to a prayer that you just vehemently do not believe in, or in some cases are opposed to, or whatever it is. It's really uncomfortable, I think, for everyone to sit through a Satanist invocation. That's kind of the whole point, just kind of showing how inappropriate the venue is for religious observance. But yeah, I think it's really about discriminating. I mean, and so what Parkersburg is doing kind of takes it to the other end, or the whole farther end of the spectrum, which is it's completely discriminatory. It is for like Catholics who again, I have trauma apparently. Christians who adhere to the Lord's Prayer, you know, that biblical sort of orthodoxy only. And there's no chance it will ever be anything else. So that's as discriminatory as it gets, I think.
And that, I think, is exactly that's how I read Kennedy's opinion in Town of Greece. He was saying, listen, we're not going to say you can't have Christian prayers at this event, but this, you know, in having those prayers, you can't be dictating, pushing Christianity onto the citizens. That was his concern, even in saying we're finding this practice that's going on in Greece okay, but our concern is that people are going to take this and use it to, you know, proselytize and to force Christianity. That, he explicitly said, was not how this should be used. You know, it was only this solemnizing prayer at the beginning with no intent to proselytize. And right. This is much more closer into the area of, you know, there's a reason why they're saying this very common Christian prayer that everyone knows. They're, you know, almost like beating the drum of like Christianity, of like, hey, you know, here we are. We're gonna, you know,
right.
This is a Christian place. You know, that's why you're here.
They're starting their meeting, "Thy will be done." You know, at the start of every meeting. So I do think there are aspects to the prayer itself that are, you know, that are problematic.
Right. I mean, as much as through like that, you kind of say that prayer, you know, like a robot in a broken record in standing in Catholic Mass, like when you really are breaking down what the verses are and what the prayer, it is proselytizing. I mean, the actual language of the prayer is really sectarian. It's, you know, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. You know, it's like, this is a statement of what Christians believe. It's really sectarian.
I mean, it's literally out of, I mean, except for the part that was added, it's right straight out of the Bible in Matthew. You know, and I mean, and as we alluded to, the thing going on in Matthew 6 there is Jesus teaching how to pray. Like, it's the archetype prayer for Christians. You know, it's Jesus saying, here's how you pray, and you're repeating that at every meeting.
So here's a question from Zach Sobey. What happens, so you indicated we filed a preliminary injunction. What happens when the city council refuses to stop praying?
Well, I mean, we've seen in cases where these types of injunctions have been granted, the city complies for the most part. So there will be scheduling, presumably, on this. The city will have an opportunity to respond. And if the judge does issue a preliminary injunction, they have to follow it. If they don't follow it, they can be subject to contempt of court, and the court can have options on how to enforce that. Typically, once the city's facing this type of thing, hopefully they'll comply. Obviously, the worst case scenario, if somebody doesn't comply, they can be fined, literally, you know, fined money, or they could be jailed. I don't expect in a prayer case something like that would ever happen or be necessary, but you know, the idea, the response so far from the city is concerning. They seem, we're going to pray until a court tells us not to. You know, the reality is they should look at the merits of the case and say, right, well, the law says we can't do what we're doing. That's the proper way to do it, rather than to actually have a judge force them to do what's legally required of them. Right. I think is inappropriate.
And if we went on the preliminary injunction, that will be the court telling them to stop. And that's exactly what he said in that clip we showed earlier. He said, I'm going to keep going until the court says we have to stop. Well, if we win the preliminary injunction, the court will tell them to stop.
Right,
so
right. Although I did see Eric Barber, one of the councilmen in the video, commented on Facebook on the on one of the news pages that they will never stop praying at meetings. So we'll see. Another question here. I'm not sure I know what this is referring to, but I'll throw it out for Patrick. Kisa Green. I think there was a city council doing this in Wisconsin up here in our backyard. The city councilor said he didn't want Wiccans to pray because it was prayers to Satan. How do you feel about them voting as a town, as apparently they did, to have Christian-only prayers? That's not legal, right? Right. I mean, I think that's exactly, I don't know that case, although...
It sounds. I know that there was, at least at one point, this goes back several years, there was a city or town in Wisconsin that was only doing the Lord's Prayer, which, if there are citizens there, if this person's from there and wants to stop it, we're conveniently located in Wisconsin, so we can take them to court and stop it. But I'm not sure that that's still ongoing. It certainly would be the same exact problem here. And this isn't the first case over the Lord's Prayer at city council meetings. There had been a prior case where a preliminary injunction was granted. So if this is going on in other communities, they can contact FFRF and we would take a look at it.
Right. Well, that leads us very well to a final question here from Monica S., who asks, how can I send you a violation from my town? So many of our viewers know this, but you can go to our website, ffrf.org, and you can report a state church violation. You'll see a tab and a link that says report a state church violation. There's a web form, and you fill it out, give us all the information, who, what, when, where, and why. Or you can email us at intake@ffrf.org, all the information. And so you can do that really easily through our website that goes to our legal department, and we will take a look at what's happening in your community. I think that wraps it up for this topic, and I just want to thank you for watching. And I also want to give a reminder, our convention is in San Francisco this year. It's November 2nd through the 4th. And speakers this year include eminent writer Salman Rushdie, the former director of Planned Parenthood, Cecile Richards, Mythbusters host Adam Savage, actor John Delancey from Star Trek, and Breaking Bad, Ex-Muslims of North America co-founder Sarah Hayter, a reverent actress, SNL alum Julia Sweeney, and the award-winning stand-up comedian Leanne Lord. Also appearing at our convention is Ensif Hayter, the activist wife of a Saudi freethinker whose persecution and imprisonment have caused global outrage. You can register online for our convention at ffrf.org/outreach/convention. And if you want to receive FFRF text alerts on your smartphone, text FFRF to 52886. Data rates may apply, and again, that's FFRF to 52886. And we will see you next week for another episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. Thanks for watching.